and welcome to Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast with Renae Hanvin, which is all about inspiring you to start thinking and doing disasters a little bit differently too. In this episode, I'm talking with Bridget Tehan, the Senior Policy Advisor at the Victorian Council of Social Services, also called VCOS, and we're talking about the role of community organisations in disasters. A little bit about Bridget. Bridget has worked for more than 10 years in emergency management in both the government and not-for-profit sectors. Bridget is currently a Senior Policy Advisor at the Victorian Council of Social Services and works to highlight the role of the community sector in building resilience and to explore the role of the sector in emergency management. Bridget also works to highlight the needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged people before, during, and after emergencies, as well as their needs in the mitigation, transition, and adaptation to climate change. Bridget is also the co-founder and president of the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. Now, I always like to start with where we met. And I met Bridget through Amanda Lamont when they were setting up the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network, which is going from strength to strength with almost 1,600 members, including me. It was great to connect as Bridget is from the community sector side of the disaster space, and she brings a wealth of information about those most vulnerable in our communities to the forefront of all discussions and initiatives. While at C2C, our focus is primarily on businesses, community organisations are essential to the community wellbeing ecosystem. And community organisations, while not profit-making businesses, they're still businesses too. Bridget, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
My absolute pleasure.
Now, I'm really excited to talk about this as a topic because we haven't had a lot in the community space in our conversations. But can you explain to me, VCOS, what is it? And the important advocacy and policy changes that you and your awesome team are driving?
Absolutely. So VCOS is the Victorian Council of Social Service. So we are the peak body for the community and social service sector in Victoria. And I think one thing that's really fascinating about the community sector and the social service sector is that it's a bit like saying the private sector. So, that which we know the private sector can be anything from, the IBMs of the world right through to your local milk bar and every small business and big business and medium-sized business in between. And I think the diversity of the community sector is really similar. So, we range from really big organisations like Australian Red Cross or the Salvation Army that, many of your listeners will be familiar with, right through to very small individual and independent organisations like a local neighbourhood house or a really small charity or community organisation.
And I'm not going to touch on it too much, which is a bit unusual for me, but to me, community organisations are businesses. So whether you are a Red Cross or you're a neighbourhood house, you don't want to run necessarily at a profit, but you certainly don't want to run it at a loss. So when I talk businesses, and I love how you've just gone straight into comparing the community organisations as, the same as the private sector, to me, they're all businesses, and we really need to focus on keeping all the businesses, including not-for-profits, resilient. And again, I'm not going to touch on that today, but I think that's a really important part to make. So any people within your networks and connections who want to build more resilience within their organisations, that's absolutely a group that we do help and want to continue helping, because I think, again, there's so much value in helping community organisations stay in business, because if they're not in business, then they're not able to help those most vulnerable in our communities. Now, what I really want to talk to you about today is there are so many initiatives that VCOS is driving, and I really recommend anyone to sign up to your emails. I know I really welcome them. The inbox is getting pretty full these days, but I really welcome what comes through, because I think there's some amazing projects that you're delivering, and I'm talking to lots of other people in other states as well. So Bridget, can we focus on the bushfire recovery project in particular? Because we know that communities and individuals are better able to recover from natural and other disasters, including bushfires, if the local community is strong, connected, and well supported. So how do we achieve this in communities, and particularly those communities who are really struggling from the compound current disaster environment?
Oh, what a fantastic question, Renae. And look, I'll go into the work of the that we're doing under the Bushfire Recovery Project shortly, but I think just to answer your broader question, I think it's really, really important that communities build on their existing strengths. And really what I mean by that is the existing networks, the existing partnerships, using those existing businesses and community organisations that are already doing such fantastic work in communities on a day-to-day basis. They're the organisations that know the community, that have the trust of the community, and I think are really best placed to both represent communities and support communities as they recover. What those organisations need, of course, is that little bit of extra support to be able to deliver either additional services or changed services according to what the need might be. I think too, in recovery, some of the other things that we need to think about are really ensuring that the right services are available at the right time following an emergency or a disaster. So, we know that in the short term, financial need can be really strong. And so it's really important that people have access to independent financial advice or financial counselling. And also legal support and legal information and advice. If you think about making insurance claims or having to rebuild, those sorts of services are really critical during that shorter term. Over the medium and longer term, we really need to think about what a community needs in terms of its well-being. So that might be counselling, or it might be some mental health support services that are made available to community members. We also know that emergencies and disasters can really exacerbate some of the existing problems that might exist within a community, or in fact cause new problems. And some of these we know through research are things like drug and alcohol abuse, family violence, and also PTSD and trauma. So it's really important that we have targeted services available to support those communities so that they don't fall down into those traps and find themselves, even in more trouble than they may already be with having to grapple with the impacts of an emergency.
So fundamental, the community organisations, and obviously, we've mentioned and we're talking about the Bushfire Recovery Project, but you can't not mention COVID and storms, and there's just so many, I guess, disruptions happening to lives and livelihoods on top of each other, particularly in the last kind of 2 years. And what I think is really key, you mentioned the whole, it's about the grassroots, people in those communities know the communities well. They just potentially need help from a capacity or even building capabilities, all those extra services. And it's very much around, I know our commitment is certainly not the fly in, fly out, or I have a different seagull terminology that I won't share here, but it's kind of, we fly over and drop a few nuggets on the community and then fly out again. And I know from our social enterprise purpose, we always hire place-based people. In fact, I'm the only person in Melbourne as our team, because I want to hire and build skills and knowledge of people in those communities, because that's where it needs to start and that's where it needs to end. So I love that this project and that you've highlighted that, because I think it's really, really vital, and obviously a big focus and commitment from our perspective as well. Now, in this Bushfire Recovery Project, you mentioned 6 streams, and I think they're really interesting. So could you share them and maybe 1 or 2 key findings from each one?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, we started off this project by going out and talking with community organisations who'd been affected by 2019 to 20 bushfires, to really understand, I guess, what the impact on community and social service organisations were, to get an understanding of what their role was during the response and relief phase, and then to really get a clear idea from them about what they felt was needed for their communities moving forward. So that resulted in a report which is available on our website. It's called Perspectives from the Frontline, and that really articulates, I guess, in the words of community organisations themselves, what happened as a result of this rapidly unfolding crisis. The fact that there were widely scattered resources across multiple events, inaccessible conditions, and the prolonged bushfire activity. It really meant that response was chaotic and sometimes seemed to be quite uncoordinated. And it also meant that the initial recovery efforts took some time to sort of settle in. As a result of what we learned from that report, we then put forward a series of different projects to help support community organisations through the work that they were going to be doing in the months and years ahead. So the second project under the bushfire recovery work has been capacity building for community organisations. And what we've really tried to do there is try to provide current advice, information, research, resources, and importantly, lived experience. And what I mean by that, of course, is giving community organisations the opportunity to hear from peers and other organisations that had gone through similar events. We know that when you hear something from somebody that's already been through a similar event, that's often the best way to learn. So we have been providing a series of disaster recovery bulletins, which are all available online, and also complementary disaster recovery conversations where we're talking with experts, with people with lived experience, with researchers and so forth around particular topics. So, for example, one month we looked at the needs of older people in relation to disaster recovery. Another month we looked at the needs of people from multicultural communities with regard to disaster recovery. So lots and lots of information and advice for community organisations. And of course, I must say that lots of other people, of course, have been signing up to those bulletins and attending those disaster recovery conversations, including, government, researchers, individuals, and a whole range of different people. So they've certainly got a broad reach.
I think the work that's being done, and again, it's obviously focused on a particular sector, but it's got such a multi-stakeholder relevance to it, which is what I really love that comes out of the work that you guys do as well, because I know it's policy and I know it's advocacy, but it has real connections and I guess like real meaning that anyone who's, I'm certainly not a specialist in the government or policy space, but I get it, I connect with it, I understand it. And I think that the outcomes that can come from it are so positive. And it's really, I guess, that stepping stone from experience and lessons learned to here's what's needed next, here's the evidence as to why it's needed, and so let's move and progress and make that change to make the community sector better.
That's absolutely right, Renae. And one of the things that I love about working in emergency management and disaster resilience is the fact that we are all in this together. When an emergency or disaster hits, everybody pulls together and focuses on what needs to be done. And I love that level of collaboration and cooperation, of sharing and networking. And so while, as you say, the information we've provided has been more or less targeted at community organisations, it's absolutely relevant to anybody that has an interest in or experience in disasters or emergencies.
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, just from my own experience, I think that's quite unique because there's a lot of data out there about, emergencies and resilience that are certainly written for the specialist industry. And I think it's quite rare, but very welcome to find information that is written, I guess, for the layman, perhaps like me. And I mean, obviously I'm an expert in the space, but I'm certainly not in the community space, but I find it really, really interesting and really valuable. Now, we've mentioned that your focus at VCOS is on inclusive stakeholders, and stakeholders is an absolute passion of mine, particularly those most vulnerable. So what are the main findings that have surprised you? And I guess the gaps that we need to quickly fill to support communities in their resilience journeys?
So I think you touched on it with your previous comment just then, Renae, is that there's not a lot of information actually available for the layperson or a community member when it comes to disaster resilience and disaster recovery in particular. When a disaster hits, there's suddenly lots and lots of different organisations that turn up. You've suddenly got local council that might have a tent over here. You've got Red Cross doing something. Suddenly there might be an agency you've never heard of, like Bushfire Recovery Victoria, and then there are some national agencies, and it's a very, very confusing and often overwhelming space. And what's really missing, I think, is that opportunity for community members to know and understand who are all of these stakeholders and what are they doing? How do I fit in? Where's my voice, more importantly? And how can I lead this journey, this recovery journey, because I know what I need and I know what my community needs. I'm the best place to be doing this with the support of those various organisations. So rather than those various organisations coming in over the top like a seagull, as you said, and saying, here's what we think you need, and we'll
Yep.
direct it, we'll lead it, we've got the money, and so forth.
Yeah.
It's really about how we empower those communities and enable those communities. And I think the gap is, as you say, in that information and advice for communities and community members.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. I mean, I'm a real supporter of shared responsibility. So the notion that came out in the 2011 National Strategy for Disaster Resilience, and I've used that ever since. And I think it's fundamental. But to me, it's also about shared understanding, because we need to understand the different roles and responsibilities that all multi-stakeholders play. And then it goes to shared accountability, because I think if we understand the role that we, alongside others, play together as part of a collective response, then we can then embrace and, I guess, empower, those people in those stakeholder groups and educate them to be able to play the role, in building resilience as well as in those recovery stages as well. Now, what's the most important thing for our listeners to know about community organisations when it comes to resilience and recovery? And this is like, I'm asking this question as the core audience person.
Fantastic question, Renae. So I think one of the great things about community organisations is that resilience is their core business. Community organisations have been building resilience and, in fact, have been using the word resilience since the 1970s. And what they do with their clients, with their consumers, and with their communities more broadly is take that strengths-based approach. Look at people's lives, look at people's situations and say, what do you have to work with that can help you get over this hurdle, help you manage this stress, help you cope with this shock or this change, and move forward in your life. So whether they do that with mental health, whether they do it with people living with a disability, whether they do it with people who may be living in poverty or living on low incomes and are really struggling, they take a very strengths-based approach. The other fantastic thing about community organisations is, of course, that they're deeply embedded into their communities. They know their community members well. They know what the strengths are, and they know what some of those vulnerabilities might be. So if I was a disaster recovery agency, for example, one of the first things I would do would be to go and talk to those community organisations in that local area to get a really deep understanding of what that community looks like, where some of the funding could be directed, where some of those strengths could be leveraged and used to help support that overall community in its recovery.
I love that, because I think, again, we've mentioned the favourite seagull a few times, but it's not just in Australia, but overseas. We've seen it with, Fiji cyclones and tornadoes, etc. as well, that something happens and then everyone who's an expert comes in and, I guess, starts to dictate and, you said have the funding and they sort of pave the way. But we really need to respect and recognise and embrace the knowledge and the role in communities that community organisations play. And I love the fact that, resilience is certainly not a buzzword in the space, because my goodness me, it's a buzzword in every other sector at the moment. I don't think I couldn't get anyone to listen to resilience about 3.5 years ago. And now I can't see anything. I think the best one I found was an organisation that approached me and they were having a forum because they'd been looking at resilience for 3 weeks. And I thought, wow, that just summarizes the, big threat that we have, because these sorts of organizations too are those ones that are coming on, where the funding is, that go into the communities as the overnight experts that can really damage community organizations and what community needs as well. So I think I've now got a newfound appreciation for community organizations, having used, and I guess, as you say, the term resilience has been around since the 1970s and really is just embedded into the whole ethos of their being. Now, I always end with the same question, because I love a bit of doing disasters differently. So most people want more than 2, but what 2 things would you like to be done differently in the disaster space? Anything at all?
What a fantastic question. And I'll go back to your earlier comments about shared responsibility, Renae. And I think one of the additional comments I would add to that would be sharing power. So one of the things I think about the emergency management sector and about government, of course, which plays such an important role in disaster recovery, it is really that they need to open the doors. They really need to open the doors and actually allow community to come in and be a genuinely equal partner in that disaster recovery and disaster resilience space. That's not a natural fit for government. Government tends to have fairly closed doors, tends to be fairly private, if you like. But I think that, as I said earlier, when it comes to disasters, when it comes to resilience building, we are all in this together. And so we really need to create a new framework that actually opens the doors and lets everybody come in, regardless of whether you're a community organisation, a business owner, a community member, the Premier of Victoria, or whoever you may be, but for everybody to have an equal seat at the table. That would be my very first thing. I think my second thing in terms of thinking about disasters and how they could be done differently is really starting to build capacity very, very early on in communities, to have communities thinking about and be prepared for shocks and stresses. We know that they're coming as a result of climate change. We've had a horrendous experience here in Victoria over the past couple of years with the bushfires, the pandemic, the floods, an earthquake, you name it, the storm, and so forth. We've really been battered. And sadly, these sorts of things are going to continue. And I think it's really important that the earlier that we as communities all think about this together, the better off we'll be when they do hit.
I love both of those. I mean, the power one, I think, is absolutely spot on. And then, building capacity. And I know, I sort of joked a little bit before, but I spent, a good 3 years advocating for building greater preparedness in business communities, clearly, because that's our key kind of focus. And, got well, it's not me, and it's not going to happen to us, and you're dreaming about this future era that's the 1 in 100 year flood. But the reality is that compound disruptions and disasters of all types are really just the new norm, and we're living differently, and the world is changing clearly around us. So I personally think that whilst resilience is the buzzword, if we don't start preparing and really have that inclusive focus to enable every Australian to get prepared in their lives and their livelihoods and the communities, then we're going to be in big, big, big trouble. And I just hope that the new federal agency and some of the changes, I know there's changes happening in the Victorian government as well, but I really hope that it's not a token kind of reactive approach, and that it doesn't just sit at the same 97% sits in recovery. And I'm not saying recovery is not needed, but I think we really need to cement a focus towards resilience, and that includes preparedness, and we'll all be better off for it, assuming we can all do it in the same way. But that's a whole other podcast about state politics relating to disasters, which, yes, we might need a glass of wine if we go down that road.
Exactly.
A massive thank you to Bridget Tehan, who's the Senior Policy Advisor at the Victorian Council of Social Services, also called VCOS, for talking to me about the role of community organisations in disasters. I can't wait till we can catch up face-to-face again, which is not too far off. Thanks so much, Bridget.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Renae.
That's the end of this episode of Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast, which I hope you found to be relevant, informative, and inspiring. If you're interested in participating in the conversation or to connect with me personally, please visit corporate2community.com. Until the next episode, stay safe, and remember, we all have a role to play in thinking differently and doing differently before, during, and after disasters.